what's interesting is it's a choice, right? Different companies will pursue it in different ways. I think Gen AI requires us to revisit the concept of what I call a value architecture. If we think about regulations in the context of ecosystems, right? We can think about, the core of ecosystem strategy always comes down to aligning partners.
Your rivals to expect their next move is becoming even more important in this ecosystem.
So if the question is, should incumbents ever play offense? The answer is incumbents should definitely play offense, right? They are slowed down compared to the startups, right? Because, as a large company, you have all that large company overhead. It's in the alignment of partners. And so an incumbent that's only thinking defense is throwing away all kinds of possibilities.
皆さんこんにちは。 NTT データ経営研究所グローバルビジネス推進センターの J と申します。本日の対談ではダートマース大学タックビジネススクールのローン・アドナー教授にお話伺います。ローン・アドナー先生はエコシステムディスラプションやエコシステム戦略の専門家で2冊の本 The Wide Lens と Winning the Right Game を執筆されています。本日の対談では技術的な変革や政治的な変革、それがエコシステムビジネスに与える影響とそれにどう対応していくかについてお話しいたします。本日の対談を通じて皆さんに有益な情報をお届けできればと思います。よろしくお願いします。
Good afternoon, everyone. We are glad to have the opportunity to host a dialogue session with Professor Ron, who just arrived in Tokyo. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. My name is Minglan, and sitting beside me is Jai, and we are both from the Global Business Development Center. And today, we'll facilitate today's session. And let me start today's dialogue with a topic that has become so hard to ignore. I'm talking about generative AI. Every week, we will see new updates and use cases related to the major large language model. And I'm particularly interested to understand generative AI from an ecosystem lens, as it provides immense opportunities of personalization, contextualization, and human-like response that could potentially impact multiple boxes of companies' value architecture. So I'd like to hear your thoughts as to whether leaders should treat generative AI as a technological innovation that will disrupt individual value elements in an ecosystem, or an ecosystem disruption that would change ecosystem dynamics, such as partner reconfiguration or value redistribution.
You already have the answer. So first, it's great to be here with you. Gen AI, this is such a key question. And I think the way you framed it, I think is exactly right, which is we have this incredible new technology and it can either be approached as a new technology, which is as a way of doing the old things in a better, more efficient way, or it can be approached as an opportunity to reconfigure relationships and kind of change what it is that we're trying to do. And what's interesting is it's a choice, right? Different companies will pursue it in different ways, and we just want to make sure that that choice is an explicit choice rather than just stumbling into a default mode. So the starting question, I think, is right, which is what happens if you think about it as a technology versus what happens if you think about it as an opportunity for ecosystem disruption. What's particularly interesting about Gen AI is that it's changing so rapidly, right? And it begs the question of what is the value of moving early, right? Because if you were to have redone all your processes when, ChatGPT 3 came out, you would have optimized your organization in a way that feels maybe a little bit irrelevant now that we're, a generation and a half before it or past it. So besides the decision about is this going to be impactful, where the answer is easy, yes, it's going to be impactful, right? The question is, as you're adapting to it, whether from a efficiency perspective or from an ecosystem perspective, how do you build sufficient robustness into what you're doing to accommodate what you know is going to come next? Right, so it's not an easy answer, but it's the question that you need the people in charge to be able to answer. Right? Like, so if I'm showing you this today and sometime in the next 2 years, I tell you it's going to be 5 times better, what would change? And you want to make sure that whatever you're building is ready to accommodate that change, rather than be surprised when things are 5 times better, right? So it's an interesting point where, when technology is changing this quickly, being on the cutting edge and then sitting on that edge is a good way of being behind. Right? We should make everybody feel a little bit better because so many companies are behind. You haven't locked into the wrong thing yet, but beginning to think about how you want to incorporate these things, I think becomes crucial.
Yeah. So, as a follow-up question for that, generative AI is actually a follow-up question of our launch discussion. So, you mentioned that in service industry, especially for example, consulting industry, which is affected a lot by the generative AI or application of this kind of auto reply systems. So how do you think, except for the industry, consulting industry, is there any other industry you think will be mostly affected by the use or the expansion of generative AI?
Well, I think this would be a much shorter list of industries that will not be affected, right? I think just about, it's hard to think who's not going to be affected,
right?
Right? But if you think about, my home industry, right? I'm a professor. What is, a key question is, what does generative AI do to, the way we understand and the way that we construct education, right? And this is, really from the top down in terms of what's the content that people need to know, and what is the knowledge base and the thinking process that educational institutions need to certify, right? So it's kind of, what do you want to teach and what do you want to test? All of that changes, and even more fundamentally, it's what is the education? It's what's the gift you're giving the student that matters, right? And if it's teaching you how to memorize a list of 50 factors, that as a gift kind of became irrelevant in the age of Google, where now you could just look it up and having it in working memory mattered less, right? So in the age of Google, it was, well, facts are accessible, but knowing which facts to access was kind of what the mission becomes, right? And now where you can ask more open-ended questions, right? The challenge becomes not just how do you ask better questions and ask better follow-on questions. It's, how do you assess the quality of the answer that the AI is giving you, right? And I think the same thing is going to be true in lots of service industries where, we can automate, the call center, but how do you assess the quality of the interaction, right? Where now, maybe you're able to reimagine it in a much better, more personalized way, but you want to make sure that you're shaping it rather than taking whatever evolving default is coming out of the system. So, I think Gen AI requires us to revisit the concept of what I call a value architecture, right? So, in my book, In Winning the Right Game, I introduce this level of analysis of the elements that you as a company think of as underlying your value proposition, right? That's different from your activities. It's different from the way the customer is thinking about the different attributes of an offer. But it's like, what is your philosophy of value creation? And then from there, we can ask, well, what does Gen AI allow, disallow, commoditize in that architecture? And that's my approach to working through these kinds of problems.
I think it's interesting that you brought up the concept of value architecture and how you are seeing a change in the education industry as well. So looking at it now, we have a new partner called generative AI, which will be either filling up one of the boxes of value architecture completely or partially. But how important do you see the role of maybe having a good guardrails on generative AI, having good data policies, ethics related to generative AI to kind of propagate this adoption in the whole ecosystem and not just one's company? Do you think these issues are as important, or do you think the value creation would maybe overshadow these issues?
It's a good question, right? It's a difficult question. I think part of what makes it tricky is we can imagine so many different ways for, here we are. It's the end of January 2025, and it's almost passé to talk about Gen AI. We're supposed to be talking about Gen AI agents, right? So AI is working with each other. And I think what that does actually is it starts forcing us to revisit the organizational boundaries of collaboration, both inside a given company, but also across companies. So when we think about data, when we think about guardrails, we think about ethics in these systems, suddenly you have a lot of independent agents, not all of which. Okay. Question number one is do you really know how to control them when they're on the AI being deployed, on your behalf? The answer is, well, we're not really sure. But now you're going to be interacting with AI agents that are being deployed on some other organization's behalf, interacting with their data. And there it feels like there's a lot of opportunity, not just for wonderful things to happen, but all kinds of accidents to happen. And so I think the startup advantage in this is going to be that they can make more mistakes and have those mistakes count for less than for large established companies who have a much bigger reputation to protect. And so the challenge for the large incumbents in this world is how do you put down these guardrails in a way that doesn't constrict your ability to act and explore? That's more kind of NTT data expertise than my expertise. But I think that's again, this is the problem with the moment of AI that we're in, is that the questions that were the hard questions 3 months ago have not been solved. And now we have a whole new set of even harder questions that have been served up, right? It's like we were in algebra class, we were preparing for the test. Now it's like, here's your calculus homework, right? And I think we're a little bit in a deficit for this, but that kind of dynamic in general means you want to go back to your core, right? And that's why I kind of go back to the value architecture as an anchor of, let's go back to what it is that we're trying to do and why.
Thank you for the answer. I think it's a good exercise to be in the right kind of balance while working with these kind of technologies, right?
Yeah.
All right. So this brings me to another topic that we have related to generative AI, and that comes from the angle of regulations and policies. So now we see the Trump 2.0 administration in the US, which largely is believed could be a pro-business government. And we are also seeing some kind of maybe positiveness towards how policies related to AI, generative AI will be looked at by this administration. So what should be done by business leaders to navigate these kind of regulations and also leverage these regulations and policies in their favor? And do these policies actually have a direct impact on ecosystem formations around the world?
We can separate out the three parts of that question, right? There's the Trump story, there's the specific to AI story, and there's the how do you think about regulation story. I can't tell you how to think about the Trump administration. My sense is that it will be highly dynamic.
Okay.
Right? That, policies will come and policies will go, and so whatever you want to build, you want to build in a way that is robust, both to changes, within this one administration, and most likely will have other administration that come after. So, the way you want to build your long-term vision is probably not on a, 4-year political cycle. If we think about regulations in the context of ecosystems, right, we can think about, the core of ecosystem strategy always comes down to aligning partners and their activities to support the delivery of a value proposition, right? And regulations can affect alignment in ways of making things easier, ways of making things harder, right? Making things more valuable, making things, less relevant. And there's a fundamental question about what is driving your vision. All right, so you can imagine there are going to be some leadership teams that are, will see opportunities that open up because of changes in regulations and use that to drive a direction. You'll have different teams that establish sense of where they're trying to go, and then they'll navigate that according to what's changing with the regulations. Right, so kind of when you think about regulations, how much of it is enabling versus disabling, but even more fundamental question is how much is pull, how much is push, right? How much is you're reacting to these changes versus these changes are, are you being driven by these changes, or are you driving and then you're just responding to them? I can't tell you that one is better, one is worse. Probably depends a lot on, what your opportunities, what your portfolios look like. But the difference that thinking in terms of ecosystems makes is that as you're thinking about regulations, you're thinking not just about what it does for your ability to act, you're thinking about what does it do for partners' ability to act and your ability to align those partners and their activities, right? Which, by the way, means that if you're trying to lobby for or against regulation, this is a more holistic set of issues to be focused on.
So the question is not about being proactive or reactive, it's about sticking to the basics, knowing what kind of value you are delivering and what your ecosystem is, and just responding to the changes in the best way. Would that be correct?
Well, no, I mean, that would be, one approach. It could be that a change in regulation is sufficiently fundamental that, what felt like a really good idea is now no longer a good idea.
I see.
But that's people know to think about regulations that way. The kind of the real addition to that strategy discussion that thinking in terms of ecosystems brings is, as you're coming to those conclusions, it's, you want to have, this wide lens approach. You want to think about how is this affecting co-innovation? How is this affecting the adoption chain challenge that I face? And then from that, how does that change the strategy I want to pursue?
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you mentioned something about the special thing about ecosystem. It's not just doing your own stuff. Your ability to gather around your partners, even your rivals, to expect their next move is becoming even more important in this ecosystem era. So I want to move on to another topic, which is also kind of trending theme in Japan, that is electric vehicle. Just as AI is reshaping industries, I think electric vehicle, the technology itself, is also similarly transforming the automobile sector. So I think it's worth noting that the automobile industry is a Japanese traditional stronghold, but with the rise of electric vehicles, it's kind of like they are facing a little bit challenges, especially in the overseas market. So my question is that in such context, how do you think that they can achieve ecosystem defense? As you said, probably it has to be a collective defense, right? So is there a defensible niche you think, Japanese automakers can take and to make them still stay on the edge?
So that's an interesting question, right? And actually it connects back to regulation. So when the City of London says that you cannot have an internal combustion engine within the city perimeter, that is a regulatory move that suddenly makes you rethink, do I want to invest in the next V6 engine? So I think the regulatory environment, electric vehicles are a place where the regulatory environment actually plays a very substantial role in parallel to the demand environment, right? And if we think about electric vehicles, about vehicles in general, we know we have different segments. We have commercial, we have heavy vehicles, we have light vehicles, we have passenger vehicles. I think what's interesting to me about electric vehicles is that it's still a highly in flux. What is an electric vehicle in the sense of, the battery technology is such a critical technology, right? And what is going to be the dominant battery technology has yet to be established. So even though we've seen all these investments in plants and gigafactories and things like that, to the extent that we move from lithium to something else over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, I think there's going to be surprising amounts of opportunity for new entrants to move in because existing investments will depreciate possibly faster than planned, right? Everything that I read about electric vehicles is it's a simpler vehicle to build, right? So you need the electronic modules are becoming commoditized, and the physicality of the vehicle is much simpler and more straightforward than the traditional ICE vehicles. So that says, one, there's probably still a lot of time to respond, right? Two, we might expect more entry rather than less, right? And three, there's a question of how much of an early mover advantage there is going to be and how lasting it is. Right, and that's where I would actually say the electrification of vehicles kind of collides with, no pun intended, but it's with the autonomous driving, right? Which again is you can have autonomous driving without electric cars, you can have electric cars without autonomous driving, but it's an industry where both of these revolutions are happening simultaneously, and there again is the question of today, it's really hard to do autonomous driving. Is that the case 5 years from now? Like once it's cracked, is it cracked by just one company or is it cracked and now it becomes kind of a commodity? You need to have a perspective on that in order to figure out the kind of bets you want to make. And again, given that everything I do is thinking in terms of ecosystems, the discussion that you would want to have is, all right, let's think about the ecosystem that needs to come together and think about, what are the moving pieces? And by the way, I would say most interesting to me and neglected by just about every car manufacturer other than Tesla is the one piece of the electric car ecosystem that is not going to go away as long as you believe in electric cars is the electricity part, is the charging network part, right? Like could be, if it's a hydrogen story, then electrification doesn't matter, or charging stations don't matter. But this is where kind of the inconsistency of the bets and the commitments being made by the traditional automakers. This is not a Japanese story. This is a global automaker story. I find really kind of odd, and is a demonstration of how history and culture traps you in an industry mindset. It seems like it's preventing you from thinking through the ecosystem game, right? So kind of maybe a shorter way of saying that is the technologies in the car are going to change. The need to charge the car is going to be universal, right? Now, again, the technologies for charging might change a little bit as well, but the value of locations, the value of the network, et cetera, that to me seems more lasting. And if I was running a car company, I'd be spending a fair bit of time thinking about that, not just, what is it, what are the features I want in, in the next model that's coming out next year.
Yeah, you mentioned the concept of value proposition, like the value of electric vehicles, not just about technology, but the eventual goal they want to achieve for the customers. So I do have a follow-up question for that, because when we think about Japanese customer behavior, because I think I read a news that last year the best-selling car in Japan is actually a K car. I'm not sure if you know a K car. It's like a small square-shaped car, very small size and small engine capacity. That is the best-selling car in Japan last year. And
not a hybrid.
Not hybrid, and we even notice a decline in hybrid and also EV in Japan. So there's a much difference in terms of like local market and also the overseas market for Japanese automakers. So in terms of the value proposition for Japanese companies, how do you think they can like align?
You're taking me way beyond my expertise. I know nothing about the Japanese consumer market for cars.
Probably if we think about like not for Japan, but some other scenario, if a company whose local market and their overseas market is quite different. So for any other, not just for car industries, but for any other industry, if this kind of situation happens, do you have any suggestions for that? How do they align their value proposition for local and also overseas market?
I see. There's always, the question of working across markets, across industries, right, always comes down to the question of synergies, right? What is the advantage that you get by doing these two things together, as opposed to, having them be done by two separate organizations? Here again, like if it's the fact that you can have, some shared service infrastructure, you would, you need the justification for the synergy.
Right.
And so maybe the more kind of the sharper way of thinking about it is looking at whether the nature of those synergies is increasing or decreasing over time should give you a clue about your corporate strategy as to whether participating in these multiple markets is going to make more sense going forward or less sense going forward, right? And if a core source of synergy is decreasing, right, then the question is, well, is there something new that's offsetting that? And if not, then the logic of that combination degrades over time, and at some point the realization is not worth the complexity, not worth the cost, right? That's the logic that I would pursue. Like where we are on that spectrum, I can't tell you, right? That's going to be a company-specific decision.
Right.
But if there's greater and greater heterogeneity in consumer tastes, well, all else equal, it means there's less and less sense in trying to satisfy everybody, right? So, but if you tell me, but on the supply side, we're getting more and more economies of scale. We're able to share capabilities, et cetera. That might offset it. Again, you need to think really carefully about that.
Okay, thank you for your comments.
Tough questions. Good questions. Good questions.
So I'm a big fan of your concepts of the value architecture and how it relates to the value proposition. I mean, just now you gave an example that if you were a car company, you would focus more on the charging side as well, which is very clear to see when you look at things from the value architecture perspective. Where are the different value elements? And you see, okay, this is a very vital value element. And you also mentioned that maybe not related to regulations, but there might be times when you have to time your move in an ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And there might be smaller companies who are doing these kind of distinct disruptions, which can then lead way to maybe higher disruptions in an ecosystem. So when we look at incumbents, should they always look at things from a defense perspective, or that is also kind of a balance that incumbents should play, whether it's in EV ecosystem or other ecosystems, where they look at their value elements, they look what thing is important for the customers, and then balance the defense and offense act?
Oh, so if the question is, should incumbents ever play offense?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is incumbents should definitely play offense, right? So incumbents have a massive advantage in playing offense in ecosystems, massive, right? Because again, ecosystem strategy is all about aligning partners, and compared to startups that have just started up, incumbents have existing relationships at scale. They can deploy relationships in ways that new entrants can't. So incumbents that can get out of their own way can do very, very exciting, very powerful things in driving new ecosystem innovation. Incumbents that can't, incumbents that when they think they're innovating are focused strictly on kind of the product development side, they are encumbered, right? They are slowed down compared to startups, right? Because, you know, as a large company, you have all that large company overhead. Once you have an idea, perhaps you can, if you can commit to it, you can scale it more effectively. But the real, again, the core of ecosystem success is not just in the execution of your effort, it's in the alignment of partners. And so an incumbent that's only thinking defense is throwing away all kinds of possibility.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think finally, I have one closing segment for us. So I think throughout the history, Japanese companies have shown good signs of alliance and collaborations with partners. And I think the manufacturing industry in Japan, the automobile sector itself, proof of that they have led these different players into one cohesive industry and are leading those industries. But as we discussed, these are changing times. We have generative AI, which is going to disrupt different boxes of value elements. There are roles that regulations will play, and it will be across industries. So what will be your message to Japanese business leaders to think about ecosystems going forward and to incorporate these strategies in their business vision as well?
So, you know, you're touching on this very interesting distinction, which is you can look at supply chains, which are, you know, massively complicated networks of interactions, which, you know, really it's, you know, the Japanese that taught the world how to manage supply chains, you know, lean production, the whole Toyota system, and think that, well, if we know how to manage that, we know how to manage ecosystems. The big difference between a supply chain and an ecosystem is that in a supply chain, everybody knows what their job is and everyone knows what their position is. And I make the brakes and I know that I send the brakes to the car assembler. There's no debate that, well, why don't you send the car to me and I'll put the brakes on and then I'll sell it to the customer, right? So what you're supposed to do and the order in which you're supposed to do it in supply chains was never an issue, right? So supply chains was really about managing a large series of largely bilateral relationships and figuring out how to share information efficiently. Ecosystems can mature into supply chains once everybody knows what they're supposed to do. But in the emergent moment, the whole debate is, the whole reason we talk about alignment is we're trying to figure out, what is the right configuration. And the challenge is that multiple parties will have a different configuration in mind, right? So we may agree about how to do electric cars, but in my mind, I'm doing charging infrastructure in cars. In your mind, I'm doing just charging infrastructure and you're doing cars, right? So there's a whole different negotiation, right? I'm sending the media message to the customer, right? I'm you're gathering the data, et cetera. There's so much more being contested across a multilateral set of partners simultaneously, right? You can't, if you can break up a network into a series of bilateral relationships, then you don't need to think in terms of ecosystems, right? It's the recognition that there are some innovations out there that can't be thought of in that way, that requires the development of this new perspective and all these new tools and frameworks. So that's the key to your question is Japanese companies and Japanese alliances have taught the world how to do bilateral relationships better than anyone else. And now the challenge is how to move into a kind of a multilateral world where we're renegotiating what is leadership, what is followership, where things are, who's linking to whom. And that I think will require a new set of muscles and a new set of playbooks, a new set of frameworks. And that's what all my work has really been trying to help inform.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Ron, for joining us for this discussion today.
It was a great
and
pleasure.
I hope this discussion will add value to our viewers as well.
Great pleasure.
Thank you very
for
much.
having me.
Thank you very much.